Anuradha is a management psychologist. She is a partner at a firm called Kilberry in Toronto, and she's someone who has been working with MPAC for over 10 years. She's got 20 years in the industry, and she also works with me in my role as the president. So I was thrilled, Anuradha, that you agreed to come and join us today because I think you can help with your experience. Just help us through some of the anxieties and excitement and everything that's happening in our world. So thank you for joining us.
I'm delighted to be here.
And today's virtual leader chat is going to be a little bit different, where we're going to make it a little bit more interactive and start with some polling questions, just to help get a vibe and a sense for both Anuradha and myself on how everyone is feeling. So Anuradha, do you want to introduce the first polling question?
Absolutely. Everyone, I'm delighted to be here. I would love to start by getting a sense of the sentiment out there and how everyone's been doing. So the first polling question that you'll see on the screens in front of you is, what is the predominant emotion you've been experiencing over the past few weeks? Think of the last couple of weeks if you can, and choose a response from the ones listed there.
Gary's going to put the polling question up, and it's this is very similar to what we've done in our mental health webinars. It's 100% anonymous, but if you wouldn't mind answering, it will help us give a sense, and it'll help with the dialogue this morning.
I'm very keen to see what comes up. I've done a few of these chats with different organizations, and I'm interested to see, as things have evolved over the past few weeks, whether there'll be a shift now that we're getting closer to opening things up.
Yeah, I'd be very curious what other organizations that you've been working with and sort of how they're feeling and throughout this pandemic. Because Anuradha, you work with a variety of different businesses, a lot of Fortune 500 companies, a lot of companies similar to ours. And so I think your insight will be very valuable for all of us.
Yeah, I hope we get to that at some point as well. And I'm sure there might even be some questions in the Q&A.
Carrie, you want to give it a few more seconds and then we'll the responses.
Oh, interesting. What do you see there, Nicole? I mean, so we see that there's actually a multitude of emotions that people are feeling. They can't just pinpoint one. That's the most endorsed one. Interestingly, some anxiety, some frustration, but also some optimism and confidence. So it's sort of a quarter, quite an even split. Any reactions, Nicole? What are your thoughts? What are you seeing? Any pleasant or unpleasant surprises as you look at this?
Yeah, I was looking at it for myself, and I would have answered the too many emotions to name just one, because sometimes days feel like, we say there's 4 seasons in a day. I think you can have more than 4 emotions in a day. So I'm not surprised to see that as being the number one. I am surprised to see optimistic as high as it is. So that makes me feel good. Hopefully it's a combination of some of the things that we've done as an organization, as well as some of the signals that are out there in the community. So I think that's a good one to see. I'm not surprised at all about the anxious and frustrated. I think everyone's feeling that as we move through this. So yeah, but a couple of people are optimistic, so that's a good thing, and confident. So I think those are I'm not surprised by them, and I'm pleasantly surprised by some of the results.
Yeah, I have to say that that's been a shift. So as I was mentioning earlier, early on in this pandemic, when things had just closed up and we did some of these, we reached out to some organizations and held fireside chats like this. There was a lot of anxiety-based emotion, and that was really the predominant one that was coming up. It was repetitive. It was high in terms of endorsement levels. As we've moved through the various phases, what I've seen is a bit more of a spread. So more people then starting to endorse not just a single emotion, but the variety of emotions, that last response options, where every day can feel different. In the same day, you can feel a range of emotions, or with time, There'll be certain days where you think you're completely in the zone, you've fallen into a rhythm, and then on another day, you wake up and you find it's really difficult to get yourself motivated to work. Interestingly, I think to your point, the sense of optimism is newer. I haven't seen it come up with any of the organizations to quite this level before. I think the weather, interestingly, does make a difference. It affects people's moods, but I think so does the fact that as Ontarians, we've really worked hard to control and flatten the curve as much as we have. So there is a forward-looking tone to the sentiment that wasn't there previously.
So what would you have said in the beginning was the overriding emotion? So we're just finishing at week 9 in that sort of week 1 to 3, 4 versus where we are today. What have you seen and what did you expect?
There was a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, and really a sense of not being in control. So people looking for answers and some degree of certainty, but not being able to find it. Those were the predominant three, all interrelated, of course, as you can imagine.
It's interesting that you use the word control because we know that when we feel that loss of control, it creates anxiety and fear and so on. So is it even realistic for us to want to have a sense of control, knowing that this is a pandemic and so many things are out of our control?
Yeah, look, I think it's absolutely reasonable that you look for a sense of control. I think it gives people a sense of strength. In some ways, it's even healthy and adaptive to search for it within realistic bounds, I would say. So let's start first with the healthy side of it. Look, I think that as humans generally, we're highly adaptive. We are introduced to change, we adapt, we're introduced to more change, we adapt further. In fact, I think over time we've seen new industries, new occupations emerge just from this sort of adaptation. At a personal level, too, I think we are able to adjust. I think of the analogy of a water slide. When you first get onto the water slide, you're a little out of control and you're trying to find your place within the slide and the speed of the water. And then at some point, you relinquish a certain amount of control, but you also learn how to navigate your body in a way that allows you to land safely. I think that's very much what this experience is like. We took some time to adjust. We found a place, and we probably will need to take some time to adjust again. Um, in terms of the other healthy aspect of what it takes to be in control, I think actually been a lot of research done that having that sense of internal control and that desire for control is not a dysfunctional thing. In fact, those who have an internal, we call it an internal locus of control, those who feel that they can themselves influence things around them they're actually less prone to things like depression. They believe that they can control outcomes and their destiny, and that they will figure things out. And that makes for a big part of resilience and hardiness. I do think that that's within bounds, however. So to try to exert control in a situation where you have none can increase your anxiety. And so looking for control needs to be balanced with a certain degree of acceptance. There are certain things that you cannot control. There are certain things that you will not be able to do. And until you accept that, you'll just keep finding this sort of internal tension. And so, to some extent, in order for you to be able to move on and adapt, you do have to accept the situation for what it is right now. So, the focus really needs to be on what can you control. I also think actually that organizations have a role to play in increasing a sense of control. So I think personally, you can try to find it. But as an organization for a place like MPAC, and you've done this, I think, in many ways already, a few ways that you can increase it is information. So I think people feel much more in control if they have the information they need. There are some companies that have kept a very tight rein on information. Information has come only from certain individuals in the organization. Managers have not really been allowed to have much face-to-face time with their teams because communication's been very centralized. And I think that although the intention it's well intended, it can have the opposite effect where people feel like they are cut off from access to information, which can give them a sense of purpose and control. So I think a very transparent information exchange is so important. I know just these VLCs are so important for the organization. As you can see from the record number of people showing up, it serves a purpose. I think the other piece is, of course, recognizing that in all of this, it's been a massive change for individuals. So you do need to think of it as, is there some change management that needs to be done to help people regain a sense of control? Even if it's a positive change or a necessary change, organizations do need to think of what change management efforts. So, for instance, if you do need to equip people to work from home, it isn't just a matter of setting them up with a computer. There are some changes that come with that. So, how do you equip them to deal well with the mental shift that even needs to happen?
Amazing. And you had me at slide, Anuradha, because the slide example is one I've never heard before, but it just brought back so many memories of being on a water slide, and that whole, you try to control it, and then eventually, you absorb it. And what goes through my mind is how many times you have to go down that slide before you actually fully enjoy it. And I think that's probably where we're at right now. And because of all of the changing facts and changing rules, I imagine that behaviors are going to continue to change as we go forward in all of this. And what explains that, how we move to those different behaviors depending on where we are in the slide and how many times we've gone down.
I personally love that one because it also just reminds me, there's so many ways to use it. I think it even just reminds me of the difference between adults and children. Children are just so much more resilient as long as they have a certain degree of reassurance. They don't have the same need for control the way we do. And so you see them thoroughly enjoy that process of going down.
The first ride, they're all in, whereas the adults were hanging on.
That's right.
Oh, that's so funny. What about the accumulated changes? So, we talked a lot about physical and social distancing, and we've heard from a lot of experts that as humans, we need interaction, and we need to give each other a hug, and we need to do these things, and we can't. So do you think that there's going to be some sort of accumulation over time on the negative side for us in this that we should be aware of, either for ourselves or with our children?
Yeah, look, I think that there certainly is an accumulated effect of these things. We've been in this now for 9 weeks, as you pointed out. There's an exhaustion that you get from something like this. I think interestingly in this experience compared to other stressful experiences, there's a real tension between being able to be together because there's a common experience that all of us are going through worldwide, quite frankly, yet we are physically distant. And I do think that physical distance is sort of a contact deprivation that exacerbates things like loneliness and isolation. And there are people who are much more vulnerable to those accumulated effects than others. I think the other thing to keep in mind is in the initial phases, when you don't know how long something is going to go on, you're able to marshal resources to do it. However, those resources, personal, physical, financial, they get depleted with time. Right now, we're in what I would consider the maintenance phase, and the maintenance phase is extremely difficult. I think what you'll find is this sort of roller coaster of emotions. There will be much more variation even amongst people. You'll see some, as we saw in our polling, who are optimistic and really looking forward to what this can herald for the world of work. There are others who are still feeling a sense of anxiety and perhaps even doom. And so that cumulative effect is likely to also endure because we're physically tired. So I think there's a real connection between stress and the physical symptomology of it. So for instance, what people are finding is they are waking up in the morning but not feeling as motivated, or they're waking up in the morning and still feeling tired even though they've had a really good a full night of sleep, perhaps not a good night of sleep. I think the many coping strategies that people often use to deal with stress were social in nature, whether in large groups or in small groups. And so it really is creating a bit of a psychological cost to being physically distant. I think of it in two ways for both introverts and extroverts. I know that can sometimes be an overly simplified label for personalities. But think of it this way, for extroverts, this time is extremely difficult because their coping mechanism is to process information with others, with friends, family, colleagues. That entire coping mechanism has been stripped from them. And there is something lost in just doing Zoom calls, for instance. Even for introverts, even though they don't necessarily get the same energy from being around groups of people, they likely have more intimate friendships, and that intimacy has been depleted. They might not be outgoing or highly social, but they may still have a really high sense of need to affiliate, to connect, and build a sense of community. They might be doing it in smaller ways, and that's really been stripped from people. I think
Yeah, no,
one of the please go ahead.
no, I was just going to say that everything you're saying, it just makes so much sense. You don't think of that as being a recharge in whichever way it is, whether you're someone who is very, as you say, extroverted and outgoing and needs to be in group gatherings, or just having those intimate, coffees with a friend and long dialogues, and all of those are gone for us. And so you have that sort of sense of loss. And I hear you. I mean, the Zoom calls, they're great, but for someone, I'm sure yourself and me, like I'm online all day long. So the last thing I want to do in the evenings is get on another Zoom call. I hope my friends and family aren't watching, but but it is one of those things where I don't look forward to it as much as maybe other people do. So it is such a change for all of us.
Yes, look, I think there's even research coming out that those, video conference calls, they're highly helpful, but when you are back to back to back, they are tiring in a very different way. And so there's this push and pull between trying to build a sense of community, but also finding that the ways in which we're doing it are not feeling natural. I think for others, some of the ways in which they have done it has been a bit of a double whammy. I can certainly share a personal example. I enjoy running, and I enjoy running with a group of individuals that I regularly meet up with. And so that's been dually removed from me. If I enjoy running, I'm finding it more difficult to go out and do it on my own. And I no longer have that social connection. So, two very healthy habits have become so much more challenging at a time like this. So, absolutely, there's a cumulative effect. I do think, though, that bringing it back to MPAC, there's a role that the organization's culture can really play in a situation like this. So, for instance, if you know that you have a very collaborative culture, always had a very collaborative culture with potlucks and a sense of community, and collaboration and cooperation, as teams, it can be very valuable to see how can we hold on to that and somehow replicate that so that we don't lose it during a time like this. So taking a moment to really think about what about our culture um, plays out in a social way. And so how can we find a way to replicate that even though we're geographically dispersed? And I think there is some need to do that, because if you do start to ponder this option of the way Twitter has, gone to offer work from home capabilities to many others, how will you maintain that sense of culture and cohesion in the organization now that you're going to deliberately engage a physical distance amongst your employees? So there is great value, not just from a temporary perspective, but a long-term perspective, in rethinking as a culture, how do we want to deal with this?
No, it's an excellent point. And, one of the things that I'm so proud of with our impact culture is the fact that they've thought of really creative ways to keep the engagement going. And we've shared many of them on VLC's videos that people have put together, cookbooks. We just finished a 21-day gratitude challenge. So, depending on your office, your zone, your department, there's so many different things that, people have really risen to the occasion to bring the impact family together. And so I think that's helpful. And I think that we're all benefiting from it. And the more we share, like one of the things we've shared, Anuradha, is pictures of our home office, because we're all now working from home. So we've posted pictures, a lot of the times it's of our pets. If you were in our database, we would ask you, as we did before the call started, about the beautiful painting that you have behind you. So, because we're all looking into each other's living rooms now, and we're all very curious. It's like a new sense of curiosity. So I think we're doing really well with that. But I want to come back to what we talked about earlier, which is resilience. So I would tell you MPAC is a resilient organization. We have gone through so many changes, from divestment to learning about ourselves to external reviews to even having our assessment update canceled this year. So this was something that we were all working towards, and we were 2 weeks away of sending our first notices out. And here we are, and we're moving forward. But what about the personal resilience, right? Because there's work resilience and there's personal resilience. So what are some ways that we can help increase that? And I don't know if it's coming back to what you can control versus not, but what are your thoughts?
I'll answer that question. I just want to maybe pick on the way you framed it up. I thought that was so interesting. I myself have witnessed that resilience and impact. So I've had the fortune of working with you guys for over 10 years. When I first started consulting to you guys, it was during Carl's time as the CAO. I've seen you guys as an organization go through multiple changes, and what has always remained with me is truly how resilient people were. There were many changes through those times, but there is a hardiness there that to me has always stood out in the organization. I think of it, and I hope you take this in the best way possible. I see it often in companies that I visit in the prairie provinces. There's been a lot of hardship, but they have grown from the hardships that come with building a life and building companies, and being in a very weather dependent part of the world for your economy. There's a hardiness to people in the prairies that's so admirable, and I see that very much at MPAC as well. Now, in terms of what hardiness actually is, I think it leads, hardiness is often what, oh, excuse me, we have a visitor here.
Well, your visitor has to at least say
Sorry.
hello. That's okay.
Well, no, now she has hidden herself.
Okay.
Excuse me I'm so
That's
sorry. Your
okay.
journal
Not at
is,
all. While
okay.
Anuradha doing that, I'm going to tell everyone about the painting on her back wall. So the painting on her back wall was a splatter paint as a Father's Day gift by her children. So that was, and I think it's beautiful. And I encourage Anuradha to get another one. And so that next time we see you, we have another splatter paint on the wall.
Yes, as Nicole was teasing me, I think if we had a child psychologist in our family, I'm not sure what their interpretation of that painting would be. She was kind enough to suggest organized chaos. I personally just see chaos, which is very representative of our family, as you just witnessed, despite all the requests to not interrupt.
That's
Um,
okay.
no, look, I think from a hardiness perspective, to me, resilience perspective, resilience comes from this notion of hardiness. I think hardiness is a personality style. They coined it back in the 70s. And what it really reflects is those that are able to cope with stress in a way that keeps them healthy and keeps them productive. Now, some of the ways in which you can really increase your sense of resilience and your hardiness is, there's 3 or 4 things. How you view a crisis really matters. In any situation, quite frankly, you can either change the situation, you can avoid the situation, you can change your thoughts about the situation, or you can accept the situation. To the extent that we cannot change this current situation, there's no point dwelling on that. Avoidance is effective, but for such a limited time. So avoidance coping strategies are not helpful. And so the other 2 that remain are how you view the crisis. Essentially interpreting it as less threatening really helps. The other thing that really helps is a coping style. So avoidance strategies are not helpful, but optimistic coping strategies absolutely are helpful. Social support helps. So I know our social support mechanisms are more limited at this time, but we can't. Sorry, you are still on camera, my friend. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
So I do think that social support mechanisms, wherever you can find them. Look, if you have a smaller bubble, a more narrow bubble, that matters. If it's those regular Zoom calls that make a difference, or those porch visits, that absolutely helps with resilience and coping. I think the last thing that really makes a difference is that internal locus of control I was mentioning earlier. So the sense that you can get through this, you will figure it out. When the dust settles, whatever is left, you will figure out how to make it happen, versus feeling like the world has imposed something on you that you can't do anything about, and now you're just sort of left with nothing. So as soon as you have a higher internal locus of control, you have a high sense of social support, you have an optimistic outlook, and you're able to, sorry, and you're able to,
Feel free to take, do you want to take 30 seconds to to organize? We'd be more than happy to do that. I think we're going to have actually another polling question that I don't know if it's now or if it's a little bit later.
that would, thank you. I will take you up
Yeah.
on that.
Okay, so maybe Carrie, we will mute Anuradha and take her off camera, and we'll put up the next polling question, and we'll get everyone's response on that. So the current sentiment of your team. We'll give it another 30 more seconds so everyone can give their feedback on this polling question. These are great results. Anyone who can hear me, wow.
Wow, I'm really amazed at this.
I'm blown away.
Supported and content is the predominant emotion, but of course, a certain extent of mix of the above. I think what's interesting to me is personally, people may not be feeling this way, but they're certainly exuding a sense of support to each other, where the team feels supported by others, even though they may personally be feeling a sense of anxiety. There's such a sense of cooperation and community when I look at these results.
Yeah, and Rod, I would tell you all of the data that we have, because we're in a virtual world. So yes, we're not in the office. We can't do the water cooler talk or walk over to someone's desk. But our Skype platform, which I think you're familiar with too, is off the charts in terms of how many minutes people are on, whether they're one-to-one calls, whether they're group calls or meetings. And so people are talking, they're communicating. So I think that when I look at these results, while I think the results are amazing and I'm extremely pleased, I think that they're valid because we're all connected. And I've said before, I feel more connected to this organization more than ever. And I'm not visiting people in their offices anymore, whereas I used to, and I'm not having that, in-person connection, but we're talking all the time. So yeah, so I think that's amazing.
I think the history between people in the organization matters. So, when someone says that they feel supported and content, what that speaks to is a level of trust within the organization, where they are during times of crisis able to band together. They're able to trust in each other enough to reach out across the aisle and offer support. Put aside any conflict or differences, of course, but just generally that ability to seek counsel and be vulnerable enough to share what might be bothering you suggests that that's actually occurring. People have adapted and found a way to remain connected.
No, it's amazing. And one of the things that I've said to the organization before, and I'll say it again, if you need help, put up your hand, ask your colleague, ask your manager, ask HR. And if you are someone who's in a position where you can offer help or where you see someone, then also put up your hand. This is one of those times where we as an organization need to trust each other more than ever. And we want to trust you as employees in your job and doing the right thing and the best that you can do. And we hope that you trust us, that we're making all of the right decisions as we go forward. So I think hopefully we're seeing some of that in some of the data and the results, but that's our commitment to you.
What's interesting, the other thing that's interesting to me about those results is hopefully what it indicates is that people are expressing what they are feeling. So a degree of vulnerability. Sometimes the question comes up, I deal with a lot of people in management, and often there's this notion that managers need to be completely poised and calm. And so this question has come up from time to time, that do I need to remain calm and be the strong one, whether for my family or for my staff or for my team? What is truly the best way to react? And so I've been asked this question: is it okay for me to show some of my emotion? Or do I need to be the steady Eddie? And so, what I think I'm seeing in those results was just generally the advice would be that authenticity is absolutely important. I do think that if you are feeling a sense of anxiety, there's a healthy way to express that. I do think that there is value in expressing some of the emotions you are feeling or some of the experiences you are having, such as you even seeing sort of the childcare challenges that not just myself, probably many of you are experiencing with children at home. There's a relatability to that, quite frankly. And I think that relatability is so important at a time like this, so that there isn't an us versus them divide that can sometimes develop between individuals as this phase continues. I think the other thing, though, that people do need to be mindful of is that there is a channel and time to vent, but optimism is really important in those conversations. And expression is important, but with a certain degree of restraint, so that it can still feel controllable within the bounds and suitable for your audience. So, for instance, if you're at home, it makes absolute sense that you would be able to share with your children that you are feeling a little tired, because this has been a stressful time, but a certain degree of restraint. They don't need to know all the details of all the financial pressures, etc., that you're on. As a leader, it absolutely makes sense to say, look, I'm also taking care of elderly parents. I'm worried about them being in a long-term care facility, expressing some of that fear and anxiety, but within restraint, with some restraint, and of course a degree of optimism as well, so that all of you can remain forward-looking.
I was going to ask you that question, Anuradha, because I'm starting to see. I think there was even an article in the Toronto Star last weekend where, a CEO said that she cried in front of her team. So she was in the middle of a Zoom sort of all staff meeting, and it was, early on in the pandemic, and she broke down. And do you be embarrassed about that, or do you not? And I look at myself in the leadership position that I'm in, and I do feel optimistic, and I do feel good, but I also have my moments, and I've started to share those a little bit. Last week was Mental Health Week, and I made a commitment where I would, post a very vulnerable post every day on LinkedIn. And there were moments where I was like, oh, why am I doing this? But the benefit for me was it was real. And
Yes.
second of all, it actually opens up people to share back with you. And many of the comments I would receive sort of offline would be, that's so inspiring. And I'm thinking, that's inspiring. Like, all we're doing is just sharing with each other, right?
Yes.
But it's not. There's no textbook for any of this. There's no textbook about being vulnerable and sharing how you are. It's just a feeling, and I think you have to, you know, make smart decisions and have confidence, but be true to who you are.
I think there's this wonderful concept in the leadership literature, but I do think it applies to all of us, regardless of whether you're in a leadership position or not. You are a leader in your home, you're a leader in the community. It's this concept of fallibility. So fallibility being that you showing that you're not perfect, that things can get to you. But that you can also find your way through it. So fallibility paired with I am vulnerable, but then I also give up and I, cover my head with the blanket and stay under for months and years is not necessarily helpful. But fallibility is absolutely helpful. It's known to predict amazing things like innovation, showing that you're comfortable making mistakes, showing that emotions are okay, showing that people are important and empathy is important. All of a sudden makes it a much more human workplace. So, hats off to you for expressing some of what you were feeling. I've seen other leaders do things like talk a little bit about some of their fears because they have elderly parents. I think Doug Ford's ratings, he was certainly, it was a very authentic moment when he was emotional about his mother-in-law being in a long-term care facility, and that was genuine. So, I think
Mhm.
people can very much make out the difference between an authentic response and a contrived one. And in those moments, regardless of your political affiliation, the person becomes relatable.
It's funny because I think he went down memory lane this week with the CNE closing. I don't know if you caught that. And I went down memory lane with the slide. So there you go. We both went down a memory lane. But Anuradha, what's the difference between vulnerability and showing emotion and humility? Because that's something where I'd like to talk about that and get your thoughts on a personal level as well as a professional level. And on the professional side, MPAC, one of the things that we've endeavored with this latest strategy is our promise to be more accountable and more transparent and customer focused. But embedded in that is humility. And so when we're working with taxpayers, we want to be able to understand and show them that we understand that this makes a difference what the value is of the property and the community and the impact. So as a business, we've moved ourselves along the way with humility, but what about as people and as leaders and as colleagues?
hmm it's a really interesting question, probably one you could get very philosophical on. But generally, I think in terms of humility, it's the understanding that there's more than one way to go about something. That there is no true single way of handling a situation. That there might be more than one perspective or perspectives on a situation. And so humility requires you to acknowledge you just might possibly be wrong. There just might possibly be another way of handling the situation, and that there's no true single way. It's sort of like glasses half full or glasses half empty. You can insist the glass is half full, but you have to be humble enough to also recognize that it's quite possible someone else may see it as the opposite. So humility is simply knowing that there's the possibility that you could be wrong or an alternate way of looking at things. I think as an organization that I imagine plays out in many ways for you and your clients and customers, your taxpayers who do sort of come back and insist that why did you not do a certain way. I think there's also something to be said for true confidence. So to me, true confidence is knowing that there are certain places that you are strong as an organization and that you get it right. You get it right the vast majority of times. But there are certain places where you know you are weaker, and acknowledging in those situations that, look, that is not a strength of ours, so we might get it wrong a little bit more often, and being confident enough to convey that. And I think that true confidence really earns a lot of respect from people when you acknowledge. And now back to your point around vulnerability, are both humble enough to put it out there that that is not a strength of mine, and vulnerable enough to be prepared for some of the criticism that might come, but also some of the empathy. So vulnerability is a little bit more on the emotional end of the spectrum, being open to sharing some of the emotions that you experience in a particular situation.
Thank you for that. Coming back to leaders, right? We know that as a role, like we're all leaders in different capacities. I look at my role in leading the organization, and we are obviously following legislation and formal health guidelines. But what is the expectation of a leader? Does it go beyond following what's prescriptive out there and really taking a stance on anything beyond that?
Do you mean your expectation of leaders towards their teams? Is that what you're thinking, or even towards themselves?
Both. I think towards themselves, towards teams. I mean, we know that we don't live a life without scrutiny, both as an organization and as leaders. But at what point is just following what's prescribed to us enough, or where do we need to go beyond that? What are some of your thoughts on
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I mean, I have two or three perspectives on that, so I'll tackle it a few different ways. My sense, and you can certainly add to this too, Nicole. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, what you've seen from some of the leaders you've been impressed with over time. But there's a few things that come to mind. I think that there is an element of there's some leaders who really thrive in a crisis like this. They're sort of called to action. They are caught up in the momentum of things, and they just really go, go, go. I think there are others who really take on other people's stress at a time like this. And so they're very entrenched in their teams and are spending a ton of time taking on the emotions of others. I think in either case, those are very laudable, very impressive efforts. What's really key to understand as a leader, though, that self-care is extremely important. It's extremely critical at a time like this. So as a leader, what that means is putting the oxygen mask on yourself first, the way they tell you to do in those airline safety videos. You know, you are likely not going to be good to anybody if any of your strategies are too extreme. Anything done in too much of an extreme has sort of a shelf life to it. And so self-care is extremely important. Making sure that you do have some boundaries in place, making sure that you are watching out for, I usually use the acronym HALT. You know, are you hungry, angry, lonely, tired? If you are any of those four things, you're likely to be much more vulnerable to being triggered, much more short-tempered, irritable, and lack the wisdom that your team needs. What your team does need from you at a time like this are a few different things: some very transparent communications, some sense making, something to calm down all the chaos of information that's out there to help make sense of the contradictions that are out there, and some very clear guidance that, look, despite what's happening out there, we are still going to do X, Y, or Z. So you said it a little bit in the front end of your speech, where your introduction, where you said, look, we're opening things up, but still do please be prudent. And so that's guidance from you, that don't just sort of be literal and look for loopholes and sort of get out there and do anything possible. That, look, you're not an essential service yet. You're not deemed an essential service. We will still be working from home. These are our guidelines and our measures that we're going to take. And then sense making, sort of, what does this all mean for us as a profession and the value we add? I imagine it's hard to sometimes hear. It's both helpful to hear you're not an essential service, you're not on the front lines. Maybe that gives some reassurance to people, but it can also cause some anxiety in people if they feel they're not an essential service. And so helping people make sense of that is extremely important as a leader.
Exactly. And I think that's, that's something that I personally, as I've moved through this, because it's uncharted waters, there's no playbook. But, we're blessed to have, a wonderful team around us. We talk through things, and a lot of times we're making decisions with only 80% of the information, but we know that we have to make a decision. We have to be decisive, and a decision delayed is a decision made. So we'll make a decision, we'll feel confident, but we also know that if we have to be agile and nimble and change it, then we will. But no, that's definitely it's an interesting time to be a leader when there's so much uncertainty out there. But I think what gives me strength is the organization that we have here at MPAC and our strong culture.
Is there anything in particular that's really guided your approach, or in the practices you followed, or that you've seen the EMG follow?
Well, the three things that the three lenses, and it's what I share at the opening of all of these meetings, is that the health and safety and wellness of our employees is number one. And so when we are in our homes, we're not out there, we're keeping ourselves safe, and we're trying to keep, when I say wellness, we want you to be well. That means mentally healthy, physically healthy. So things like not being worried that your paycheck's going to go into your bank account, things like having mental health resources available to you, support mechanisms for your family, all of those go into that equation. The second thing is keeping the business running. So we have a very vibrant business. We are, while we're not deemed an essential service, we are an essential service to municipalities. They are relying on us and the work that we do this year in order to fund themselves through this pandemic. So our work is important, and we need to do everything we can to make sure that we deliver on it. And then finally, just making sure that we do our part. So we do our part both as MPAC employees as well as citizens. So those three things, we've said right from the get-go, and they still stay true to this day, and they will be the lens that we use as we move forward. So as the economy starts to open up, as decisions start to be made, we'll look at those three lenses, and if we have to retreat because something happens with the pandemic, we'll use those lenses again, because it's about the health and safety and wellness and keeping our business going and doing our part. So that's been my my guiding light through this whole thing, and I keep reminding myself of that, and we talk about that in all of our meetings, and so it's been really helpful. It makes the decisions actually a little bit easier.
There are a couple of things that stand out for me from what you said. I mean, I think the first one is having some guiding principles is extremely important because there'll often be some decisions that are difficult to select between. And so if you have some pre-established guiding principles, both people can hold you accountable and you can hold others accountable, but you just end up having a goalpost against which to measure both your success, but also make some decisions. I think the second thing that really strikes me is that sense of purpose that you have created by clarifying to people that there is a role that you play, that as soon as you come out of this pandemic, municipalities will be relying on you. I think that sense of purpose is so critical for the resilience that we were talking about earlier, that people feel like when they show up for work and they turn their computers on in the morning, there's a reason they're doing that. They fit into the whole somehow.
Absolutely. And municipalities are relying on it. And just like we're more connected than ever as an organization, I think we're more connected than ever with municipalities because we've
Mhm.
been nimble, we've been understanding, we're working with them so that things that we deliver to them, that they can handle them at the right time. But they've also shared, like, we need this work product from you. We just may not be able to process it today, but we will in a week from now. Now, I know we have another polling question. Do we want to pull that up, Carrie? You ready for that, Anuradha? All right, we have a third polling
Yes.
question. All right.
So our third polling question is just to shift the focus a little bit from the workplace. We're curious what the current sentiment is in your personal circle. What are you seeing and hearing from friends and family close to you or in your extended family?
This will be interesting because we talk about trying to bring our best self to work, but we also, one of the things I posted last week in Mental Health Week is that everyone has a story. And so we only know a certain piece about each other, and then there's a whole other part of ourselves. And so it's important how you are, it's important how your team's doing, but it's also important what's happening in your personal life because it's inevitably going to affect you.
Right. And I'm sure we'll perhaps we'll have time for this before we go to questions, but I'm really keen to see what the responses are because there's that blurring of lines between personal and professional at the moment.
And more than ever. Once we come back with the polling answers, we'll get Carla to come on.
Hmm.
Hmm.
So frustrated, tired, optimism again, but also worried.
Hmm.
It mimics, I think, some of the emotions we saw at the outset, where our circles are feeling much the same way that we are feeling. It's not surprising. I think this is a community event at the moment, that sense of insecurity and worry that's out there. I don't, even if you are personally in a good circumstance, it is hard to escape that general culture at the moment that is embedded in so much uncertainty. And a lot of these are signs of stress. So I think burnout is something for people to really watch out for. It's not burnout in the same way as before, where you might be going at a furious pace. In some organizations, they still are, in others, work has had to come to a standstill. But it nevertheless is, these are signs of extreme stress and exhaustion in some ways.
Absolutely. And I know there's a term called compartmentalization, and we do our best to do that. But if in your family circle or personal circle, there is a lot of these emotions, inevitably, as much as you try and put it over here, it's going to creep in, I imagine.
Yeah, I absolutely think so. Look, while some people have not minded the flexibility that working from home has created, it has blurred lines between work and personal life. I think that's important to recognize because all of us before sort of knew that you had that hour in the car to de-stress or to get in the zone for work before you got to work. And while you made a couple of phone calls to check in on everyone during the day, you knew that once work was over, you were home, you were sort of getting the kids ready for bed, et cetera, et cetera. Those lines are existent at the moment, as you saw with my daughter walking in. I think what's really critical, though, is that you do find ways to to observe some boundaries. What that has meant for many people is make sure you make your own space. So, if you can find a corner in the room, preferably with the door, that's helpful. Though, again, as you witnessed, a door does not seem to always matter. But for the most part, it does create a mental separation. Um, Create some blocks of time. So be clear on when you're going to start work, for how long you're going to go before you take a break. Create some specific times for breaks. So take lunch, and end your workday at the same time. What you'll find yourself doing is it gives you some cues around starting and ending work. It actually also creates a degree of predictability for your family. And for some people, they've sort of struggled with how do you manage the family. I think particularly with older kids, knowing when they will have access to you is sometimes helpful. And then creating some rituals is extremely helpful when compartmentalizing. So that might mean what is something that you do every day, every week, every month, perhaps every day or every week with people at work or in your family. We have a ritual within our organization about getting together as a team twice a week, and certain things that we always discuss, both light and business related. Within our family, we found a board game that's now a ritual to start and end the day, that has really surprisingly caught on. So finding those rituals can really ground individuals.
Great. Well, we're almost out of time. I just want to see, Carla, if there were any questions before we move on to the rest of it that might be pressing for Anuradha.
There's a lot of good dialogue coming in from the questions from our staff, but one that probably a lot of us can relate to is for people who have newfound anxiety since COVID, do you have any tips on how they can cope?
I think that is such a great question. So for anxiety, look, I think first of all, recognizing that it's completely reasonable is extremely important. I think the other piece of anxiety is sometimes what anxiety can lead to is a very natural reaction to prefer to avoid, to sort of pull the blanket over your head and stay away, if you will. In a situation like this, I think I heard one of your speakers, an earlier one, sort of have structured time for worrying. But after that, I call it move into opposite action. So if you're feeling a certain way, you almost have to force yourself to get out there and not avoid. So allow yourself certainly a time to acknowledge. I wouldn't just dismiss the emotion. It is absolutely important you self-validate, acknowledge without any sense of guilt that you are feeling anxious. I think right now the other emotion a lot of people are feeling is a sense of guilt. I have it better than someone else. How can I complain? I think guilt is a natural emotion, though not particularly effective. I think what's more helpful for people is if you demonstrate some empathy, if they can hear and feel your empathy. The guilt is not particularly constructive. For anxiety, I think opposite action is extremely helpful. Reconstructing how you think of the situation. So, as I had talked about earlier, looking at it as less threatening, looking at the facts of the situation, and challenging whether the assumptions you're making are actually true can be extremely helpful. And then the self care. So, what I'm finding is sometimes the anxiety is compounded because people are not getting enough sleep. They're either overworked or they're going to bed late, perhaps as an avoidance strategy. They've been drinking a little bit more. Substances can help you fall asleep, but create for a more restless night of sleep. So those are the things to watch out for.
That's great. Thank you. And I think that's a powerful question that come in, newfound anxieties. Maybe people who didn't have a lot of anxiety before, but now during this. And so now you have this whole new emotion. And I think that's great. I'm a big believer of self-care. I'm a big believer. I've said it to all of you before, win the morning, win the day. That's my hour, the first hour of every morning. And I try and set myself up for the day. And if I'm having a bad day, I say, well, tomorrow's another day. I'm gonna try it all over again.
The morning with the day. I love it. Love it.
Well, thank you so much, Anuradha, for joining us. I always enjoy talking to you. You're always so insightful, and I always say that I just say something and you say it back prettier to me. So I think you did a great job here with everyone on the team. I'm sure they all enjoyed you. And if we have follow-up questions, maybe we weren't able to get to on the call, we might ask you after, if you wouldn't mind just answering some of them, because we post an FAQ document on our intranet site. We have a dedicated page where we'll share this video and we'll put all the FAQs on. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank your daughter for interrupting, because you know what? I know that that's what we're all dealing with, and that's okay. It's just the way it is right now. So thank you for that. Before we sign off, we are going to play a video. We end, I think I told you, Anwar, we end all of our leader chats with a little bit of an inspirational video. And this one is the new Justin Bieber and Ariana Grande video called Stuck With You. So we'll play that. But just before we do, I want to let everyone know that next week, as you know, we're moving to twice a week of virtual leader chats. So they'll be happening on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And on Tuesday, we will be talking with our information services team and getting a little bit more insights with what's happening in the call center and the central processing facility. So I'm really looking forward to that conversation. And I hope you all have a wonderful long weekend. I know that this is the start for many of us of the thought of the summer being the May 24 Victoria weekend. Hopefully we'll get a little bit of nice weather, and I hope you all enjoy it and do take that time to rest and recharge, because I think, as Anuradha mentioned, burnout is something that we all need to be mindful of. So I wish you all a wonderful weekend. I thank you, Anuradha. I look forward to speaking with you again.